Stranger Things, Week 11, Aliens. So basically, we could go back to the beginnings, really, of time with regards to what we might classify as unidentified flying object reports. There's lots of accounts in the medieval period and from the classical world where people have seen things in the sky that they can't quite explain. And although they wouldn't identify them with extraterrestrials in the way that we do today, they did seem to believe that there was something peculiar or supernatural with a lot of these phenomena. Now, when we get into the contemporary period or near contemporary period, the closest association with the modern UFO, I guess we could say, phenomenon is the Great Airship Wave of 1896 to 1898, which basically what happened was people reported seeing various types of gondolas and large balloons appearing throughout the sky across North America, so both in Canada and the United States. And basically, according to lots of little small town newspapers, there were many publications of various accounts of some stories where people would have personal narratives of meeting or witnessing occupants or inventors of various vehicles emerging from the sky, taking off and landing, etc. So to give you a sense of exactly what these were like, here's a brief description of one from the Decatur Daily from 1897, April 16th. So noted that on the previous night an airship landed near Springfield, Illinois. Farmhand John Haley and local vineyard owner Adolph Wenke said that it landed 5 kilometers west of the city along the Jefferson Street Road. They said a long-bearded man then emerged and inquired what town he was near. Haley noted inside the car was seated another man and also the scientist's wife. He said they usually rested during the daytime in remote parts of the country in order to conceal the vessel's huge wings. When they asked the scientist his name, he smiled and pointed to the letter M, which was painted on the side of the car. After bidding the farmers farewell, he pressed a button and the ship flew off. Okay, so this is an eyewitness account as reported by a newspaper, and as I said, there were hundreds of these, and really this became a large part of public consciousness. So you can see that in terms of aviation and technology at the time, this is pre-airplane spaceship creation. So this is really technologically what is within the public consciousness of the era. And we can see this kind of manifesting in popular culture, particularly through the writings of Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, which you can see here. The wizard himself is someone who's come into Oz and probably described as a wizard because of his operation of the State Fair balloon, which he arrives and departs in. So we can see that there's this association with these airships being connected with the inventor or the, I guess we could say, magical person in kind of this sense where we could associate it with the wizard, but we see the idea that these things are out of the normal, but yet they are also to kind of this homage to the new age of innovation and science that is emerging towards the late 1800s into the early 20th century. As part of this age of invention and technology, it was also the age of colonialism and exploration. So in one testament of this was the case of the Scandinavian adventurer Solomon Andre, who in July 1897 led an aerial expedition via balloon that left the island of North Spitsbergen. And basically for the next couple of months, people around the world reported sightings of seeing Andre's aerial expedition flying through the sky, although there was never any actual trace of him that was ever found. And basically the original flight was supposed to be over the North Pole from Scandinavia into Canada. So as part of the, I guess we could say, interest in the trip, a lot of news stories were reporting sightings of this airship. So in essence, Andre never arrived, and it wasn't until 1939 that they found out that just off the coast of the island of Spitsbergen, where they had taken off originally, there was another small island in the Arctic Ocean where they found the frozen bodies of the crew. So basically, just shortly after they had originally launched, the balloon surface had become covered in ice, which therefore caused them to have a crash landing in this small rocky outcrop. So back in those days, there was no Coast Guard to come and save you. So ultimately, the expeditioners that were part of Andre's crew ended up meeting their end on this small island. And what's interesting about this is, despite all these press reports and releases that the crew had been seen or their balloon had been seen overhead in the skies, ultimately this was impossible because they never had even gotten any remote distance from home. So in this sense, we see a lot in the similarities of the commentaries and kind of sightings, this kind of precursor to the modern day UFO report. And also too, at the time, it's interesting to note that the truthfulness of the witnesses was called into question. So similar, kind of in the same theme once again, to this notion of people who come forward with UFO stories are usually doubted and to a certain degree ridiculed in the press. So to the larger airship phenomenon, it's interesting to note that these are basically a product of their time, or the zeitgeist or world picture of the people who are actually encountering or witnessing such phenomena in the skies. So in this sense, there is it's really a product of its environment. So this is, in a sense, culture really leading people's experience, so to speak. So we can see this in the fact that even though researchers in the era, really from kind of the mid to late 1800s, so as far back as 1844, there were basically patents issued by various inventors for such flying mystery objects as aerial cars and flying gyrators. But overall, so we could say in a sense that it is hypothetically possible that people did in fact see such experimentations taking place in the sky, and this could account for the possibility of what people witnessed. But at the same time too, then obviously as well, other people in terms of explanations at the time, a lot of these sightings were attributed to various night sky misidentifications, such as stars or planets. And this is exactly, as you'll see in the upcoming content with regards to modern day UFOs, this is comparable to what is usually dismissed in terms of what people actually encounter versus perception. So there is this notion that there's this great technological age of exploration, and these two things are really in public consciousness. So this idea of pushing the boundaries. So in Jules Verne, the scientific early science fiction writer, we see this idea of 20,000 leagues under the sea. And then through H.G. Wells, we get into this other notion of not just looking at the possibilities of a living civilization other than our own beneath the ocean, but now we go into the possibilities of there being one that is extraterrestrial or beyond, I guess we could say, the perceivable limits of our sky, so into the cosmos or outer space. So this is War of the Worlds is probably the earliest true scientific science fiction account of aliens contra human beings in kind of a war scenario. And really, in this sense, okay, well, basically for those of you who aren't familiar with this original story, it takes place in southern England, and it's basically overrun by a technologically superior Martian race, who in the end, the only way that the attack is halted is due to what we might say the aliens' inability to cope with the biological diseases of Earth, which is an interesting association in current times. But overall, for Wells, he basically gets this idea of thinking in terms of through the lens of his own culture, which at the time British imperialism was at its height. So the British Empire was ultimately at the pinnacle of its reach. And specifically, he was bothered in the press by one account with the British occupation of Tasmania, and contemplating as he did through sympathetic vantage point was this idea of how would this affect the Tasmanians, right? So how would the Tasmanians perceive this militarily superior force that basically they were at the mercy of? Okay, so this is where he gets this concept of this notion of what would it be like, okay, if basically Britain encountered such a superior technological force itself. And where does he need to expand upon that? Well, there's no such group in society that thinks such things, so he needs to take that into an extraterrestrial frame of reference. And this is, interestingly enough, this becomes dramatized in the 1938 radio program of War of the Worlds. And reportedly, a large number of the public were panicked because they weren't sure if the Martian invasion was fiction or if the actual broadcast was a news report. Interesting aside. So prior to the actual 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, the whole concept of science fiction really expanded through fantasy pulp magazines of the 30s, 40s, and 1920s. So in this, what we see is the origin for some of these magazines, Amazing Stories being a prominent one, and Weird Tales being another very influential manifestation. But when these pulp magazines begin, what we see is the reproduction primarily of Jules Verne's and H.G. Wells material, and then it starts to build off from there. So we can see really in the process of 3 decades, you can examine by some of the beautiful cover art here from just a random sampling. If you want to see, there's over 4,000 different ones on the link below through pininterest.ca. But they are, you can think, over the course of the 30 years from the 1920s up to the 40s, that public consciousness really becomes opened and influenced by this conception of life on other planets, exploration, spacecrafts like alien crafts, Martians, okay? And in this sense, this is really what precedes what we would call the origins of the UFO age. So intrinsic to this concept, we see once again culture preceding reality. And there's been various theorists such as Paul Ricoeur, who is a French postmodern philosopher who focused on the study of interpretation and particularly the role of narrative and stories. And various other individuals have come around since, such as Richard Kearney. But what the basic gist of their idea is that really people develop modes and understandings of being through the role of narrative. So this could be fictional, it could be religious, doesn't matter. People all of a sudden start seeing their world and their possibilities of agency or acting within that world through the frames of reference that they're exposed to through such things, for example, as these various Martian alien accounts. So we can see here that this is really the cultural context that becomes popularized through the pulp magazines of the 20s. Really, this goes up probably even to the 1950s, but really the origins of the UFO craze are post-World War II and into the 1940s. But we see even in these, we see the narratives for the beginning of comic books, okay, and then popular television serials such as Star Trek, or popular movies such as the Indiana Jones series, or even Star Wars itself. So really, these are manifestations that have come out of this cultural context. So ufologists basically suggest that the modern era of UFOs began on June 24th, 1947. And this is basically when Kenneth Arnold, who was a fire control engineer pilot, took off and was flying in around Mount Rainier in Washington State. And basically he was on assignment on a rescue operation, but ultimately he sees several metallic disc-like objects flying kind of in the distant horizon. And as they get closer, what he notices is that they basically don't have any kind of back tail or typical fins on an airplane. So this really quite shocks him. And his description of the actual, I guess we could say, UFO is basically that of like a flying disc, and close to the image here on the left. Now, it's interesting too that in comparison, you see here on the right, this is the Ho 229, which was basically a German prototype fighter, which was a jet-engined flying wing. And it was basically prototype that was nearing production towards the end of the Second World War by the Nazis. So basically they were testing this airplane or flying wing into like 1944. So we see here there is this conception of this tech 3 years earlier in Germany, kind of near towards the close of the war. So the possibility that he in fact may have seen flying wings is historically documented and known that this type of technology did exist. So according to American records, this should not have existed in the States. So what we see here is kind of this discrepancy. And as we'll talk about later, particularly with such types of German technology, people begin to theorize with regards to what influence this has on the UFO phenomena at large. So after we can see here's a picture of Kenneth Arnold pictured on the left here, and he is pointing to an artist's rendition of what he describes as what the flying wings looked like. And basically once he gets out of the airplane, he comes down and he basically wants to tell people what he's seen because he's so shocked. So he goes to the local Pendleton newspaper office and speaks with reporters there. And the output of that exchange is Bill Biquette's article, which basically describes the occurrence of what happened with the Arnold sighting. And this paper or story is distributed nationally through the different newspapers across the continent. But as various newspapers are publishing the story, the headline writers of the local papers altered the actual original title to include the words flying saucer. So this is actually the first reference to a flying saucer to be documented. So we can see here really in 1947, it really is the origin of this concept, which will move forward into the phenomenon, moving into the actual high period of UFO sightings and identification. So the most famous of UFO crash sites is Roswell, or located in Roswell, New Mexico. And basically just a month after the incident with Arnold takes place, so this would be July 5th, 1947, July 4th and 5th, there's a rancher by the name of Mac Brazel who on the night of the 4th was watching the skies during an extreme lightning storm. And he heard this massive boom, but he didn't think it sounded like thunder. So the next day, he's out riding his horse and kind of exploring his area for the pastures, etc. And he comes across this large mass of debris, which is basically scattered across a huge area of over 400 meters in length. And basically what he finds there is this strange mixture of ruins, which, as described by him to the authorities, was incorporated by some kind of strange tinfoil dark material or metallic strips, which he was able to crumple in his hand, and upon releasing it would reassume its original form. And basically, it would not remain in a bent or wrinkled condition. And also on top of that, he noticed that there was odd writing inscriptions like hieroglyphics upon the actual remains that he determined or found. So basically, with that, we see the origins of something in these kind of strange, when we say materials, that would seem to be otherworldly, or at least of an advanced technology that seemed very odd to Brazel. So Brazel, after finding this wreckage, takes some of it home to his house, and he goes to the local sheriff, George Wilcox, and basically explains what he's found. Now, Wilcox, in turn, contacts the nearby Roswell Army Air Base, who sends out Major Jesse Marcel, who was an intelligence officer, and he basically interviews Brazel and examines some of the debris he's brought back with himself to town. And upon hearing his story and seeing the materials, Marcel thinks that what Brazel's probably stumbled upon is a crashed aircraft. So he travels with Captain Sheridan Cavett, who was a counterintelligence officer from the base, out to the crash site to investigate it. So Cavett and Marcel go investigate the actual crash site, or hypothetical crash site, and then they return to the airfield and inform their superior officers of what they found. And through the press officer, Walter Haut, who is basically ordered by his commander, Colonel William Blanchard, to send out a press release to the effect that a flying saucer had been captured. So on July 8th, a couple days later, the Roswell Daily Record runs the headline, RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region, which you can imagine would have stirred up a lot of public interest and shock and surprise. Here's just an image of the original front page of the Roswell Daily Record with the headline of the actual flying saucer being detected in the ranch. Basically, in this move by the Air Force, what we see is an initial response, which would not have probably gone up the chain of command and considered the actual fallout implications that such an announcement would make upon the general public. Obviously, this type of thing would probably be quite alarming and scary to people. So this probably might be interpreted as what we might say the fallout of an immediate occurrence, where sometimes information that is leaked may not be as guarded as later actual expressions from authority would have liked. So after the initial press release, and what we've said so far is ultimately what the Roswell affair is really about in its historical manifestation, at least in terms of the initial eyewitness account and in terms of the feedback from the persons involved in the actual incident itself that are historically traceable with regards to the original incident. But after this has been released to the press, the debris itself is actually collected by the military, and it's shipped to Brigadier General Roger Ramney in Fort Worth, Texas, a member of the Air Force. And there, basically, he examines the debris and he readdresses the local media and explains that it's actually not a flying saucer they found, but it's actually just merely a weather balloon. So whether or not this is actually the case, UFO conspiracists would say this is just a mere cover-up, but at the same time, perhaps this was some form of balloon. What exactly occurred, obviously, is a matter of belief. Now, after the initial account, and really where the Roswell becomes one of the foundational events of the UFO community is in the growing of the legend, which really arises not until like 1979, 1980, when Charles Berlitz and William Moore publish their book, The Roswell Incident. And basically over the next decade, more people who lived in the area come forward with different eyewitnesses' accounts, different photos, such as this one, emerge supposedly of military experiments, etc. So we can see the original finding of some downed, unidentifiable tinfoil-like, dark tinfoil-like materials with strange hieroglyphs on it, to all of a sudden we see the actual mythos or story expanding, with more eyewitnesses who supposedly had come across the wreckage stepping forward with even more elaborate and fanciful details of having witnessed gray-like aliens at the crash sites, bodies, or even surviving ones attending to the actual ruin of the rest of the craft. So comparably, the concept of alien abductions really also begins to take flight, so to speak, also in the 1980s with publication of various books, such as one by Whitley Stieber, which was titled Communion, and then Intruders by Bud Hopkins. So along this side, okay, it basically brought the concept of abduction into popular consciousness in a way that it just simply wasn't there before. And in the same way we see with the airships and the actual pulp fiction, when the general public becomes aware that such a phenomenon is possible, that is when accounts of various types of encounters, abductions, okay, this is when they really start to take off in terms of reporting on them. And obviously it may be because lots of these accounts are supposed to have taken place prior to the 1980s, but either this is bringing people out of the woodworks with regards to things they had experienced earlier, or this is bringing people to out of the woodwork to basically gain a degree of fame and notoriety based upon what we might say dishonest methods with regards to presenting false testimonies, perhaps. But various accounts that really have an upswing in terms of actual occurrences are different types of aliens invading people's bedrooms, which we could see as a manifestation almost of the sleep paralysis phenomenon, such what we talked about with the actual shadow people. Okay, so you can see if this was actually implanted into people's subconsciousness, how these phenomenon of the shadow persons, etc., or the old hag phenomenon, could actually start to manifest as various types of alien figures. And then others too, such as drivers reporting to have been snatched from the vehicles when they're out on remote country roads, or also too in terms of following upon the medium tradition and the parapsychological tradition, we have people reporting that they have been the recipient of various messages telepathically through various omnipotent space beings who are communicating with them, and usually about a message of human evolution and peace. So the most celebrated and probably most reported case ever in abductee history is that of Barney and Betty Hill, who in 1961 had a strange occurrence on a trip. They were coming back from Quebec from a vacation back to their home in New Hampshire. And basically on their trip, as they were driving, they noticed that a bright star-like object seemed to be descending and then keeping pace with their vehicle. So at first, they believed that it was just simply some kind of space rock, like maybe a meteor or a star. But eventually it became such a focus of theirs that they decided to stop the car so they could get a better look at exactly what it was that they were looking at. So eventually they looked, they kind of got a sense, they kind of determined that it was basically perhaps some kind of meteor. But after getting a second look, then they decide maybe this is just an aircraft heading for Canada. And they start to get back in the car and they resume driving. And then, oddly enough, it seems that they feel like they're almost being followed by this object. So once again, kind of getting a little creeped out, because now it's really starting to get much closer in the night sky to them than they are comfortable with. So at one point in the road, they turn around a bend, and all of a sudden, 30 meters above them, up the highway, they see this object appearing, basically right beside them, hovering motionless in the sky. And this is where they basically describe what they've seen as a broad disc-like craft. And at this point, Barney stops the car, he gets out, and he's holding up the binoculars to get a closer look at what he's seeing. And then, upon doing such, he notices that the craft all of a sudden shifts over to a nearby field. And then, basically, Barney decides to go and investigate for a close. So here's just an artist's rendition of the scene with the actual aircraft being depicted according to the Hills account of what it looked like. You can see here almost two small wing-like objects with the red lights on the side, and then there appeared to be some kind of windows built around kind of the spherical or disc-like hull of the actual aircraft itself. So the heart of the actual encounter, as far as the waking Barney and Betty Hill were able to account for immediately after, is that Barney grabbed a handgun and he goes off towards the field to go get a better look at the craft. And he basically describes it as being approximately 25 meters in diameter with two rows of rectangular windows along its edges. And within the windows, Barney can basically see these strange little creatures that are making odd gestures, and this frightens him. So at this point, he decides he's not sticking around. He basically hightails it back to the car, and he yells to Betty, like, let's get out of here because we don't want to be captured by these things. So then he drives off as quickly as he can, and they have this sense that they're being followed by the craft. And it's like there's this strange vibration that takes a hold of the car, and they feel like something like bounce off the car. And even though they have this experience, they press on in probably utter terror for a long period of time, but eventually they keep driving. The craft seems to have disappeared, and they eventually reach home. So that is the basic narrative of the Hills as far as their waking recollection recounts. But afterwards, after the events taken place in the next upcoming months to years, Betty starts to have dreams about being taken aboard the spacecraft, being, I guess we could say, medically examined by the aliens. She kind of develops this perception of what the aliens look like, which is demonstrated in this watercolor image. And she has this sense of communicating with them. And really, this is where a large part of the actual narrative derives from, is through the dreams that Betty starts to have. And basically this has a negative effect on both Betty and Barney until the point where they seek out the psychologist Benjamin Simon. And he puts the Hills under hypnosis and pieces together over a series of sessions a consistent narrative of their joint UFO abduction experience. So once this becomes better known, then all these themes that have become associated with the actual account are where these become crystallized, such as, for example, the medical examination, certain characteristics of the aliens, and then to their understanding that somehow or other the reason this wasn't part of their waking consciousness is because there was, when they got home, they decipher after the fact that there were missing hours, and they didn't know how they could account for that time. But basically the concept is that the reason the time was missing is because the time was actually spent when they were abducted and taken aboard the ship is where they lost that extra period of time. So we can see here really what becomes kind of the prototypical gray aliens in UF circles, and really the staple for later depictions thereof. Now, typically the entire eye is dark like a pupil in later gray manifestation, but certainly here we can definitely see to a large degree kind of the shape of the head, and to a certain degree the kind of the wide spaced eyes and similar shape of the eyes. So eventually the Hills go to the US government and they report their experience. And through an inquiry, the Air Force, through basically what we'd call Project Blue Book, investigates the case. And ultimately, their findings on the story, they determine that basically the unexplained craft and encounter could be explained by natural causes, and suggest that really what the Hills had seen was the planet Jupiter rather than an actual spacecraft that was coming towards them. So in this sense, once again, we kind of see this call back, just as we saw with the spaceships, or the airships in the late 1800s. We see this appeal that, oh, you probably saw, it was probably some explainable phenomenon where it was a strange light that ended up being a planet versus an actual craft. So Project Blue Book itself is basically a response from the U.S. government to investigate all the sudden plethora of sightings that started to be sweeping the nation. And really, Blue Book itself started in 1952, but it was the third study of its kind, and it was preceded by Project Sign, which started in 1947, and Project Grudge, which was in 1949. So we can see here the U.S. military is interested in terms, or Air Force, I should say, is interested in terms of what people are seeing. Okay, and overall, Project Blue Book had two ultimate goals. The first was they wanted to determine whether or not these UFOs people were seeing were a threat to national security. And second thing they were interested in was scientifically analyzing the UFO-related data. So over the course of basically what amounts to approximately 16 years, they collected thousands of different UFO reports and analyzed and filed them. And basically, it was all supposedly brought to a halt in December 1969 when the project was terminated, with basically what we might say a report came out in 1968 called the Condon Report, which basically suggested that the whole UFO phenomenon, there was really nothing behind it to any larger degree. So despite this phenomenon, people speculate whether or not that really was the end of the Air Force or U.S. government's interest or study of UFOs. But ultimately, since '69, it has been what we might say refuted by official decree. Now, despite this, UFO lore and sightings have continued to grow. So in part of this, we can see that through the various accounts that people have generated in terms of encounters, abductions, okay, contact being made, while these are growing, also people's understanding goes beyond what we might say the original account of the Gray, which were largely identified with the Hill and the actual Roswell incident. So beyond the Greys, which themselves have become further refined with, as we said, the entirely dark eye, various types of other aliens such as the Nordics, the tall whites, reptilians, Andromedans, insectoids, Lyrians, and the now infamous Anunnaki start to emerge, with various different accounts as to regards the significance of each various race and their intentions that are geared towards Earthlings and the fate of the actual planet. So one major subsection that has become of major interest lately is the ancient alien hypothesis, which is deeply associated with the Anunnaki. The origin of the ancient astronaut theory can go back to an author by the name of Erich von Däniken, in particular his book Chariots of the Gods. And within Chariot of the Gods, basically the overview of what Däniken is focused upon is this understanding that a lot of the religious deities of the past and religious structures such as the Great Pyramids, okay, these demonstrate technological achievements that are basically unexplainable. Okay, to this day, people are not entirely sure how the Great Pyramids were constructed. So, in elaboration of such, what we might say, reported instances of surprisingly advanced technological achievements, then Däniken presents his theory that basically sometime thousands or millions of years going back in ancient history, that what people worshipped as the gods were in fact not of some kind of supernatural origin, but were of an extraterrestrial origin. And in this sense, basically this is what we see being the source of these advanced technologies that are otherwise unexplainable. The other main theorist behind the ancient astronaut theory is Zecharia Sitchin, who in 1976 published the book The 12th Planet. And he's the first one to link the Anunnaki with this advanced humanoid extraterrestrial species that was first identified by by von Däniken. And he suggests that the Anunnaki are basically originating from the planet Narubu, and they had built a base here approximately 500,000 years ago. And the purpose they had originally come was in search of gold, because ultimately they were interested in this precious metal and the mining thereof. So the origins of the human being, in comparison, Sitchin suggests that humans were created as a hybrid species that was not fully Anunnaki, but was, I guess we could say, bioengineered to be a type of slave species of miners to actually harvest the gold for the Anunnaki. And basically the reason that they still aren't here is because Sitchin claims that they had to temporarily leave the surface because of the time which we associate with the biblical Great Flood, basically destroyed their bases here, and that was the reason for their swift departure after having been here for so long. So closely associated with the Anunnaki is the biblical reference to the Nephilim, which is also present in the book of Enoch, which is really the account of the fallen angels. But commonly the Nephilim in the Bible is normally associated with the word giant. So the understanding of it, according to popular tradition, is that there were originally a race of giants who were created through the sons of Adam, the daughters of Adam being, I guess what we might say, interbred with the fallen angels. So for Sitchin, he basically suggests that this myth theme, or what we might say religious narrative that we've really kind of identified already with various types of Gnostic themes and the religion of Gnosticism and kind of Hermetic / Neoplatonic themes of the sense descent into matter, we get this association, okay, with the Nephilim being these ones who have fallen or have come down, and I should say the Anunnaki are the fallen, or the Nephilim are the product thereof. So Sitchin for himself, he doesn't really focus upon the original, what we might say, religious motifs, but now he's basically reworking the narrative to suggest that what was once religious or supernatural angelic beings of the fallen variety have now become aliens, okay, specifically as Anunnaki. And Stitchin basically suggests that even though the text doesn't speak of the sons of God, the plural form of Ben Ha Elohim, which are the sons of the Elohim, is basically, when we normally translate it, people think of it to mean the gods. But literally, he suggests it's the term should be associated with the lofty ones. So if we're thinking in terms of our planetary cosmology, we can see these that are quite often associated with the angels in Hebrew tradition, of the lofty ones, or kind of these creative energies that are represented by the planets, taking on the mythological form of the angelic, or in this case, the Elohim, as the lofty ones. Now these are being turned into ancient astronauts who have come from another planet. So ultimately what we see here is just a reworking of the mythic themes into a contemporary context of the alien or UFO cultural. So as we said, you can see here by the Sumerian image here of the giant in distinction to the smaller human being there. Okay, what we have in reference to the actual Nephilim tradition is kind of the same theme once again of the daemon tradition from the Greeks, right? Where the Nephilim, or the giants, are considered to be part human, but at the same time they're associated with the mighty men of old, or the men of renown, which to the Greeks are the heroes. And if you recall back to the lecture, we said that the daemon, as in this entity that travels with people as kind of a guardian angel, is from a former race of heroes. So we see this tradition carried on in the Greeks as the daemon, but here we can see that the Nephilim themselves are separated from Stitchin and turned into basically what we might say the offspring of the Anunnaki, or an alien race that have, I guess we could say, commingled with humanity to create the race of giants. So largely, Stitchin abandons the historical religious deities and kind of their mythological associations in his pursuit of linking them with what we might say alien beings. But traditionally, the Anunnaki were a group of deities, and they were associated with the various mythical traditions of the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and the Babylonians. So really the ancient Middle East. So according to this tradition, the Anunnaki were basically portrayed as 7 judges who sit before the throne of Eshrigel, who is pictured here as the goddess of the underworld. And during the old Babylonian period, it was the Anunnaki were actually believed to be the chthonic deities of the underworld. So chthonic just simply means this would be closely associated with the understanding of the Titans in the Greek mythos, right? Or fallen angels in the Hebrew. Because they're associated with the powers of chaos. So pre order and governance of the current what we might say ruling deities. So in Hebrew this would be Yahweh, but in Babylonian traditions this would be order that had been established by the sky god Marduk. Okay, but we see here this concept of these Titanic-like beings or chthonic entities as part of the oldest generation of gods. So even in Norse mythology, we see the distinction between Odin, Loki, and Thor contra the giants of old. Okay, so this is a common theme that goes through a lot of the old world religions. And in this sense, there are the order of gods who are overthrown and banished to the underworld. So replaced by the younger gods. So Stitchin's emphasis doesn't end with the 12 planets upon the focus of the Anunnaki and the planet Nibiru, but he goes on to write several more books, including The End of Days, whereby he basically suggests that what's going to occur is that the reason Nibiru is out of, I guess we could say, scientific consciousness is simply because it is a planet that is out of sight or out of detection in terms of its 3,600 year orbit. Okay, and so as almost like a prophetic, I guess we could say, dictum, he suggests that this planet, Nibiru, is going to return sometime around the year 2900, right? And at the same time, as part of the Anunnaki legend, humanity can expect that the Anunnaki will return, and potentially even earlier than the return of the planet of Nibiru. And so in a lot of associations, we see this return of the Anunnaki linked with this shift to the notion of the New Age, which we spoke about in the first week, as this understanding that we are entering into a new age in the Hindu or ancient great year, which is 36,000 year cycle, okay, in the great astrological age. Currently we're entering into what we would call the age of Aquarius. So comparably, Nancy Lieder was an American woman who lived in Wisconsin who claimed that she had basically been contacted by gray extraterrestrials called Zetans who were from the planet X. And they had basically implanted a communication device in her head, and her message from them was that they were claiming that they were returning, and that the arrival of planet X would come back into orbit immediately. And upon this, basically, civilization and the Earth would be destroyed. So according to Lieder, basically planet X is roughly 4 times the size of the Earth. And it was supposed to reach its closest approach on May 27th, 2003. But lo and behold, 2003 eventually came and passed without incident. So Lieder basically, upon kind of having her prophecy unfulfilled, suggests that the true date itself is a secret and she postpones it. The reason she gives is simply because she does not want to tip off those people in power, to give them enough time to declare martial law and trap people in cities while they're basically awaiting, okay, this return, which she suggests she's doing out of goodness in order to avoid the death and fall of society before necessary. So in Lieder, we see this development of the Stitchin/ancient astronaut motif from planet Nibiru turning into planet X, but we also see an overlap with a lot of the themes we see in mediumship. Just as we said, a lot of these instances started to take place kind of with the emergence of the 1980s and the various phenomenon linked with the abduction case of the Hills. So we'll see this is a common theme that gets elaborated, particularly as it intertwines with various connections to not only this race of technologically superior beings that are encountered in the Anunnaki, but also too in terms of certain individuals having the ability to speak with such entities through a telepathic sense. So one such reported medium is Maria Orsic, who is associated with the Vril Society and the Nazis. And basically, we can think of Vril itself as kind of an extension of when we talked about the occult powers of the subtle body, such as Mesmer's animal magnetism, okay, or this idea of the astral light, or potentially the odic power, right? So once again, we have this kind of celestial power re-emerging in the form of it under a new title. Same form, but a new title, which is According to those who relate, the story of Orsic and the Vril Society is now manifest as the power of the Vril. And according to these sources, it basically their desire to obtain and master this power was due to the prophecy that he who would, or she in this case, who would master the power of the Vril would master the world itself. So basically, Orsic was the leading medium of a group of beautiful young psychics who belonged to the Vril Society. And according to the literature on her, they began to receive messages from a supposed Aryan race of aliens from what we would call the planet Alpha Tauri in the Aldebaran star system. So according to accounts, Maria and Sigrun, her sister medium, learned that 500 million years ago, the Aryans, who also go by the name the Elohim, comparable to Sitchin, or the Elder Race, began to colonize our solar system. And in this colonization, there were basically two different classes of people in the world. There were the Aryans, who were basically a subservient planetary race, who are known as the master race. And then there were the, I guess we could say, the other race who were basically evolved through mutation and the climate changes, who were subservient to this race. So you can see here kind of the same motif that follows in Sitchin through the distinction between the Nephilim, are those who were the giants, contra the actual humanoids or human beings. So once again, we have this superior race coming from above, where there are a certain element of humankind which are what we might say of extraterrestrial origin, or at least of birthright, extraterrestrial birthright, whereas there is a less evolved component of humanity, which is understood to be kind of the brunt laborers. So for the Sumerians again, or for the Anunnaki again, this was the miners of the gold. But in this case, it's less distinguished, and just simply that they're subservient to the Aryan or master race, which is kind of an interesting blend of Sitchin and really Nazi ideology to combine the Vril, what we might say, story. So in essence, the overall goal, just like Nazism itself, was that through the Nazis, this Aryan alien race were going to carve out an empire for themselves that would eventually rule the world and basically be an extension of the off-planet empire of such an extraterrestrial. So as part of their mediumship abilities, the Vrilrinnen, or the women such as Maria and Sigrun mediums, basically the story goes that they began to receive transmissions from this alien race. And as part of this communication, they were basically dictated diagrams and blueprints of various advanced flying machines. So with this sense, they're able to access this alien tech, which is beyond human technology and sciences. So through this, then the Nazis are able to build advanced aircraft, such as the wing we saw earlier, and various other ones we'll look at here, such as this almost what we might say, I guess we could say, saucer-like aircraft that was supposedly built by the Nazis towards the end of the World War. But as part of this mediumship, it was believed that Maria Orsic and her fellow mediums were able to make such contact due to their long hair serving as a receptive antenna to such alien messages. So you can see here the picture of Orsic, and her hair almost goes down to her ankles, it's so long. But in this sense, we once again have this advanced alien race and this connection with the telepathic communication through the medium. So the various advanced tech that the Nazis supposedly received through the Vril mediums were such advances in anti-gravity spaceflight. They had reportedly established space stations and also accomplished time travel. Okay, along with developing spacecraft that were able to travel at speeds that exceeded warp speeds. So there seems to be a record of some historical basis with regards to the advanced Nazi tech. And in one manifestation, this comes in a quotation from 1959 by Captain Edward J. Relpit, who was basically the first head of the Project Blue Book. And also, too, what he basically suggests is that when World War II ended, the Germans had several radical types of aircraft and guided missiles under development. The majority were in the most preliminary stages, but they were the only known craft that could even approach the performance of objects reported by UFO observers. Okay, so obviously we see here kind of this tribute to the rocket engines and the flying wing that we originally talked about at the outset in comparison to the Arnold account of the flying wings in 1947, right? So in this sense, this where we get this kind of overlap with advanced Nazi technology and comparison with it being associated with extraterrestrial advanced technology, we see this overlap here. So as an extension of that, one of the other famous associations with UFOs and Nazism is the bell, or Die Glocke, which was, I guess what we might say, one of the first flying objects to be connected with the Nazis. And apparently it was supposed to have occult markings on it and to be rumored to have been very similar in terms of its vertical takeoff to an actual rocket ship or perhaps a UFO, in terms of the way it wouldn't require a straight runway, but it could simply lift up off the ground in the same means that later helicopters were able, but at the same time obviously not having the blades of a helicopter. So interestingly enough, we see this kind of tech appearing in Canada, particularly through the Avro company. And if you look at the link here, in 1953, they basically were research and developing, testing the AZ-9AV Avro car. And if you actually see the image here, what we're basically looking at is a flying saucer. So reportedly, it had an estimated speed of up to 2,400 kilometers an hour. And at the time that Avro was making the car, it was reported that the German engineer George Klein remarked that basically he wasn't typically impressed or surprised because these were designs that had already been developed during the Nazi era. So the question is, according to UFO conspiracy theorists, would be basically, had the Canadian Avro company acquired such tech through connections with the Nazis. So basically, eventually, despite this supposed advantage with the alien tech, the Nazis do end up losing the war. So the question then arises, what happened with all this advanced alien technology? And specifically, according to the Vril Society, where did the Vril go? What happened to Orsic and her fellow mediums? So two different accounts have been reported. One being that they basically left this world and have gone back to live with their extraterrestrial counterparts on the home planets of the actual Aryans. The second one is that they have a secret base in either Acapulco or Antarctica, where they're basically hiding out in wait for their eventual overtaking of the world with this advanced technologies. So what's interesting about the Vril is that author Frank Lost has basically suggested that contrary to really the references that have come out kind of in what we might say popular UFO accounts of the group and individuals, that he basically reports that in terms of trying to find any kind of historical existence, it's basically complicated because it appears, according to the historical record, there's no traces or fingerprints of a historical figure by the name of Maria Orsic. And at the same time, even though this seems to be, we might say, fabulous or concocted, it is also true that it bears some kind of consistency with the historical record in basically what we might say is a comparable situation where, in fact, at the end of World War II, a lot of the Nazi scientists were scooped up by the American forces in an operation known as Operation Paperclip at the end of the war, and they were brought to America basically to help fight the Cold War with regards to their knowledge of advanced rocket. So in total, over 1,600 German scientists and engineers and technicians, the most famous being Wernher von Braun, who basically came over at the end of the war, and von Braun himself brought his V-2 rocket team. So we see here this advanced Nazi tech being exported from the German Nazis to the U.S. government. And the question that a lot of people have in connection is, are a lot of the sightings that people have encountered, are they related to this Operation Paperclip and various types of classified experimental aircraft that may have developed out of the Nazi predecessors with regards to technologies that would seem alien to the average person who may have glimpsed a sighting in the actual night sky? So this concept that the U.S. government is in league with advanced technologies is a common theme amongst a lot of ufologists of kind of the contemporary bent. One individual, Stephen Greer, who is author of the book Unacknowledged, he basically suggests that over the course of the last 3 decades, there's basically been 2 different U.S. governments. So the first one is that which most of us are aware of, which is elected officials. And then the second one is what he identifies as a shadow government, which is made up of mid-level functionaries who basically operate according to various black ops organizations that were launched in the 1940s by President Truman. And the original name reportedly for this black ops entity was known as Majestic 12. And it was tasked with keeping the truth from the public regarding the various discoveries of UFOs and the existence of extraterrestrial life and technologies. So in this sense, what Greer is arguing for is, yes, there's a conspiracy, but the conspiracy is not that men are using UFOs as a cover story for experimental aircraft, but yet that basically the conspiracy is that the government is trying to keep the actuality of UFOs and alien technology secret from the people. So kind of in league with a lot of the conspiracy terminology that's going around about the deep state or the cabal or secret government, Greer suggests that where all of this technology in these black book operations is going in what are called unacknowledged special access programs. And basically what happens is annually $80 billion to $100 billion are being spent of taxpayers' money in the U.S. government, which is on record, into such unacknowledged programs and projects. So in this sense, what's basically happening is that these technologies that are being developed are being kept out of reach and out of view from the masses. And one aspect of that is ultimately, Greer thinks, is that they've developed the capacity to provide free, clean energy to the world, but are withholding that information. And specifically, the reason they would do that, he thinks, is simply out of the desire for power and control. In comparison, another big ufologist of contemporary period is Richard Dolan, and he has the concept of the breakaway civilization, which, comparable to Greer, is this idea that there are multiple space programs besides the one that we're publicly conscious of at NASA, which are basically operating in the shadows. And in this sense, what's typically happening is that a lot of different technologies are being held secret from the average person, and what's resulting is what Dolan claims or has labeled the breakaway civilization, where there's a mass distinction in terms of how the two elements within society are going to live. So there is the breakaway civilization, who will live according to the advancements of alien tech, who will experience the benefits of advanced medicinal, technological, and life extension technologies. And then there's the majority of human beings who this is going to be kept from. So we can see this theme manifesting in popular cultures, various types of movies, such as the Hunger Game movies and books, and then also too, probably more interestingly, in Matt Damon's film version called Elysium, where we see science fiction really mirroring the socio-political reality of our era, where there seems to be a breakaway civilization, which we might say are the richest element, and a growing, what we might call, or diminishing middle class with a growing poor element of humanity. So in this sense, we see science fiction overlapping with socio-political truths, and also as well bridging into this conception that there is somehow this link back, that someone has been able to contact or been in contact, or at least found these superior information, sciences, technology through exposure to such extraterrestrial means. So in large part, the focus of Dolan's concept of the breakaway civilization is that, again, and this is almost reminiscent of Stitchin and the Vril Society too, is this understanding that there is a race that are set apart, such as the Anunnaki or the Aryan, and then there are the remainder class, who traditionally have been the laborers, but now in the breakaway civilization scenario, they are the ones who are going to be left behind and forgotten. So, according to John Michael Greer, who is different than Stephen Greer, he's the chap who wrote the Encyclopedia of the Occult. We've spoken about him several times. He's a ceremonial magician, someone interested in esotericism, etc. But he also wrote a book on UFOs called The UFO Phenomenon, Fact, Fantasy, and Disinformation. And he is, even though the book was not particularly well received by ufologists in the UFO community, the reason for that being is he kind of poo-poos the whole phenomenon and suggests that, hold on, maybe like what we're witnessing here are actually similar to what we suggested with this understanding with Operation Paperclip. Okay, is that maybe this whole UFO phenomenon is really built around the actual sightings of real world technologies. So one place where he sees this really being exemplified as what is the case is in 1997. There was the publication of a declassified internal study by the CIA and its involvement in the UFO controversy. And what we'd say a National Reconnaissance Officer historian, Gerald K. Haynes, basically, Greer suggests that he drops this following bombshell. So quoting Haynes, Greer reports on that according to later estimates from CIA officials who worked on the U-2 project and the Oxcart A-12 SR-71 Blackbird project, over half of all UFO reports from the late 50s through the 60s were accounted for by manned reconnaissance flights, namely the U-2, over the United States. This led the Air Force to make misleading and deceptive statements to the public in order to allay public fears and protect an extraordinarily sensitive national security project. Another example that Greer notes is that of the incident or the sighting. This is one of UFO's classic sighting cases of in 1948 a P-51 Mustang pilot by the name of Thomas F. Mantell basically ended up flying to his death in pursuit of what he appeared to be an unidentified flying object. And at the time, it was the initial reports or claims by the Air Force as to what had occurred was basically that Mantell had been, I guess we could say, tricked by chasing the planet Venus. So the interesting thing about this case is that it wasn't until several years later when the actual program that was involved in the sighting, known as the Skyhook program, became declassified, was it that the actual what had really occurred came to light. And basically what had happened is the actual strange appearance or unidentified flying object that Mantell was chasing in his P-51 Mustang wasn't in fact the planet Venus, just as we've seen the military use in the case with the Hills, as well as in the earlier cases with the American air balloon phenomenon or airship phenomenon. Okay, we see them using that as an explanation or a scientific explanation behind the phenomena, but in reality it was actually a type of ice cream cone shaped balloon, and it basically had a red upper end and then kind of a silvery whitish bottom. And the reason this was withheld was because at the time it was a secret technology that was being tested for aerial reconnaissance and espionage purposes. So you can see here why the military would go to the lengths of coming up with the Venus explanation in order to protect the secrecy of the actual technology that was being tested, and which unwittingly Mantell and his 51 Mustang had encountered without knowing the specifics, which tragically too led to his demise. So another historical precedent that Greer suggests in order to prove his point is the operation from the Second World War, which is known as Operation Bodyguard. And the concept of the operation is basically the Nazis were kind of trying to predict the Allies where they were going to try and invade the continent. So where they were going to leave from England and land in France or whatnot with regards to the attempt to invade or re-invade the continent, to come and take the fight to continental Europe. It's just kind of so as the Battle of Britain is kind of turning around, then the Allies are going back on the offensive to go back and to attack Germany in the homeland. So for a long time, part of the disinformation campaign that was elected by the British in particular was the creation of various types of decoy, what we might say landing signals or signs. So many like inflatable tanks, etc., had been created and amassed and kind of taken along the coastline, indicating to the Germans aerial reconnaissance that, I guess, through means of deception, where there may be an actual landing or not. So in this case, what we see in this historical precedent is this link with the defense agencies with a notion of disinformation in terms of being a device utilized by the military establishment in terms of a manifestation of war and what we might say military strategy. So in this sense, we could see, or Greer particularly suggests that he sees the phenomenon or explanation of the UFO as being a ploy in and of itself to explain the actual operation of various secret technologies, etc. So in sum, we've basically seen how eyewitness accounts of strange phenomena have pre-existed what we'd call the modern UFO period, which started in 1947. And basically, through the Hill abduction and the Roswell event, we also noticed too that it wasn't really until the 1980s that the grandiosity of the historical accounts was expanded upon, and through kind of their what we might call archetypal influence, greater frequency and greater elaboration with regards to details kind of developed subsequent to their what we might say founding cases. So basically what we can see in the earlier historical accounts is a mix of popular conceptions and earlier precedents, particularly through the influences of the pulp fiction writers, of the scientific what we might say publications such as Weird or Strange Things and Amazing Stories. Okay, and then the fictional writers such as Jules Verne's and H.G. Wells. But even prior to that, we see this inclusion of religious themes, gods, and parapsychological abilities from the past and the occult re-emerging within the popular mythos of the UFO community without really an awareness that of the predecessors or the kind of pre-existing tradition, which we've basically looked at up through the course until the present. So what we see here is this being paired likewise with the tendency of rewriting history, particularly as expressed through von Daniken, Stitchin, and then even the Vril Society materials with regards to the role of the Nazis and the advanced alien technologies. And really this even continues up into the present day with the breakaway civilization narrative and the advanced alien tech that Greer identifies as well. So next week we're going to basically see these reworkings developed even more in the explanation of the various extra-dimensional entities and realities that we'll be exploring. But in that, what we'll see is even a deeper tie with traditions of the past, particularly when we look at the work of Jacques Vallée. But for now, what we really want to identify is that a lot of the UFO phenomenon specifically has really come out of a lot of the esoteric / parapsychological tradition of the occult and the religious of the past age. So to understand the contemporary UFO phenomenon, one really needs to be well acquainted with the actual teachings and history of this tradition.